Well, good morning. I have been requested to use a microphone today because our video audio expert says that we will come through much better this way. And today is also going to be a day we're going to open things up for a lot more group discussion. And so what I just ask for you is I will pass you the microphone, and it would be helpful if we used it. And you do kind of really have to be right on top of it for it to pick you up if you want to have something to say. But welcome one and all to Sunday Forum today. Today's theme with the blessed vulnerabilities is blessed are those who mourn. And I had a sort of a different kind of experience recruiting speakers for this event. There were some people whose grief was too near to their hearts still, too raw to be up here. But maybe one of the blessings of today is that I'm looking around the room and I have fair confidence in saying this. We have all lost someone, haven't we? You live long enough, and honestly, you don't have to live all that long to experience the pain and grief of loss. I want to start off by sharing a pastoral story, and I know that Don is okay with me sharing this because he shared this with everyone. But Don Donaldson, who some of you may remember, longstanding member of St. Mark's, but wasn't physically present here in church for several years because he was homebound. And he was in his 90s and lived a very simple life because he didn't have a lot of mobility, a lot of health issues. But perhaps most acutely of what I always sort of knew and experienced in my visits with him was that he mourns all of the people in his life that he has lost. And there comes a time that I kind of pray that none of us ever get there, but some of us do. You live long enough, you could potentially lose almost everyone in your life. He lost a wife, he lost a daughter, and in particular, thinking of his daughter, I mean, that is what he looked forward to, being in heaven and having her run into his arms once again. And for a man of a certain age, as can be, I found that he was incredibly open and honest about his grief and his pain, even though his daughter had died 40 years ago and his wife 20 years ago. I mean, this was something that was still very much that he carried with him. My pastoral care professor once said, well, he says this all the time actually, grief is the hole in the soul that will never be filled. And I really like that because it gets to the heart of why there's so much pain, I think, because we make connections. Those people, their love becomes part of our lives. And then when they're gone, there is a missing piece from our lives. Kind of reminds me of Shel Silverstein's The Missing Piece, if you're familiar with that. And that is so hard. There is a hole. There is a missing piece within us. Appreciative of my panel up here, smaller panel than previously, but Anna Wagner has been and served as a hospice chaplain, and Dr. Bob Bray has served as a hospice doctor. So both of you have been kind of on the front lines in a way of experiencing grief and mourning. And so I just want to pass it off to you. Bob, are you comfortable going first?
Sure.
All right, thanks.
So just in anticipation of this panel, I was thinking about, well, what am I going to focus on, or what are my biggest impressions? And I think that that I'm impressed with the work that I've done in hospice about how many people mourn before the death of somebody. And that's not always possible. If someone dies suddenly, or they die in trauma or something like that, then that's an entirely different set of things that people mourn typically. So, but that was a very common theme of patients that we, and families that we helped in hospice, was the issue that people are mourning the loss of someone over time before death actually happens. So that was kind of the thing that really stuck out in my reflection anyway about that. You know, I think one of the challenges that we all have is how do we help people who are mourning? And I have a short list of things that are typically not helpful, which I don't think we need to focus on right now. Maybe we can come to that later on. But you know, I think that most of us are just very uncomfortable around someone's grief and someone's mourning. That's not always the case, and a lot of us do better than others. But I think that more than anything, people just want to know that you acknowledge it, and you know, you don't have to come up with something dramatic to help support someone in their grief, other than saying that you're so sorry. And I think those statements are just very, very appreciated by folks. So anyway, those were some of the initial things I was thinking about, and so that I don't dominate anything, I'm going to pass it on.
All right.
So I too was reflecting. I served both as a hospice chaplain as well as a hospital chaplain for about 10 years. And I don't want to repeat what he said because I thought the same. But I was thinking about my time in the hospital actually. And in the hospital, you'd get a lot of patients who had a new diagnosis, or a conversation with someone who had a different form of loss, i.e. loss of driving, loss of ability of movement. And there's a lot of grief in those experiences. And we talk a lot in chaplaincy about the ministry of presence and being available to people in those moments and letting them put voice to the feeling, to the emotion, to the pain. That is something that I was reflecting on, as well as that there's always moments that folks don't expect in terms of humor or laughter that comes in the midst of grief. We're normal. Grief comes in different waves, so that's the process. I was thinking about, for me as well, I've had a lot of losses, a lot of joys in life, and each is different and unique. So I would care for oftentimes women, because women outlive men, but women who were losing their second husband, and so surprised at how different the grief was for them in that experience. And sitting through some of the guilt that came for some people in feeling like, why is this a little easier or unique in a different way? And so I felt that my gift was to be present, I think is yours as well. And to recognize that there's times in my experience when I would recognize something is true for me in their grief. So the process of acknowledging that and letting the work for me happen as well, but not with the patient or the family. I also got to serve as bereavement coordinator for a couple of years, so I walked with people for the first 2 years of grief and loss. And there would be some people who would say, I'm fine, which is that anticipatory grief work that they did. And others who needed weekly support groups or support from me. So I really tried to go into my daily life with curiosity and learning. So, there you go.
How about if you just repeat our questions, that way we won't have to pass it around?
Oh, that's a great idea.
Okay, so
Okay.
my question is, what's the difference between grief and mourning? They kind of
That-
sound synonymous.
That was exactly what I was going to lead with, right?
Great minds.
I know. Yeah.
Answer it.
Oh, great. Okay. Sure. It's a matter of words, but words matter. How do we distinguish grief from mourning? And Anna, I heard you mention another word, bereavement is another sort of word. And I was thinking about this morning. How would I sort of conceptualize these things? And it almost feels like, in my mind, grief is a period of time where you're in this state of being, whereas mourning feels more active to me, like actually expressing that grief in some way. But that's just where my mind goes. I'm curious to hear, do y'all make such distinctions?
That's fair. I don't know if I would particularly make a distinction, because I think the experience of pain and suffering brings mourning and grief. When you were talking about that, I was thinking of the wailing I've heard at bedsides, and that is definitely mourning, especially for some of those sudden deaths or youthful deaths is often with the mourning. I also worked for a year as a chaplain fellow at Seattle Cancer Care Alliance and worked with folks receiving stem cell transplants. And when you think of mourning and grief, these are folks who are on their last hope and are living into great hope with the very strong reality that they may die within 24 hours. And to me, that was the hardest place to live. And I felt that experience was more mourning to me than any of the work. You want to answer?
I actually thought about that because I thought when you had asked me, we talked about grief, and then I saw it in there as mourning, and I thought, well, so do I think they're different at all? And I don't think there really necessarily is, but I guess in the way I was thinking about it, so this doesn't mean it's true, it's just how I was thinking about it, is I was kind of thinking about grief as something that happens immediately, or something that you're in the middle of, like with a loss or someone who dies, and then you're grieving that. Whereas I have always kind of thought about mourning as being this sort of culturally accepted period of time. So this process of which everyone sort of expects, which you can tell these are all very loaded terms, but where everyone expects you to be a certain way or act a certain way or do a certain thing in the process of moving beyond someone's loss. And I was, we don't have an incredibly diverse population here in Spokane, but occasionally we wind up having these very culturally defined expectations of somebody and how different that mourning can be.
Yeah.
I remember a colleague of mine whose father died abruptly, and she someone had called her and told her, it was in the middle of the day, we're all working, seeing patients, and she went into her office and closed the door and wailed. And we were all, sitting outside the door thinking, well, what, is she okay? I mean, what do we do? And we waited an uncomfortable period of time and thinking, how are we going to help her? How are we going to deal with this? And finally, somebody, I don't think it was me, got up the nerve to knock softly on the door and open it and say, is there something we can help you with? And she sort of paused enough to be able to get some words out and said, this is just what I need to do. And
Amen.
Close the door, please. We closed the door, and she continued to wail for a while. And so, you know, on the one hand, I'm thinking, well, God bless her for being able to do what she needed to do at the time, even though she was probably very acutely aware of the fact that we were all standing outside the door, you know, uncomfortable. And it was kind of like, well, that's my discomfort. That's
Yeah.
what, you know, she's doing what she needs to do. And there was a cultural reason later, she informed us for that. So anyway, I think when it comes to grief and mourning, I think of mourning more as an ongoing process.
I have a question for the two of you. In your professional capacity, you're still, I assume you're still human beings who experience grief as you work with people who are grieving. And I wonder how you've parsed that in your own experience, or maybe can think of a setting in which that was particularly challenging for you to differentiate your professional skills at the same time that you acknowledged a person's grief and maybe experienced some of that grief yourself.
Yeah, I'll start since I've got the talking stick here. And everybody heard the question,
Yeah.
correct? Do you think it came through?
I think it did.
I'm right here, so.
All right. Yeah, I mean, it kind of gets to that whole issue of self-disclosure. And from a medical ethics standpoint, it's kind of interesting how there are some people who feel that you should separate yourself entirely as a medical professional and not allow your own personal stuff to be at all involved in your discussions with patients. And in part because that, you know, as the medical professional, if you say, well, here's how I dealt with this, or here's how I responded to this, it can kind of, you know, hold that up as well. Obviously, that's the right thing to do, whereas clearly, you know, this is territory that everybody needs to navigate for themselves. Although, then you talk to other folks and they say, well, at times, when you're careful about those boundaries, self-disclosure can be very helpful and effective for people to feel maybe some validation. If that's the appropriate thing that you're doing as you're disclosing your own stuff. But you know, I think it's a difficult thing as a person to, you know, have to be accessing your own things that you're grieving about in the middle of watching someone else go through that. And I always have to be careful that I'm not mixing those up. The last thing I want to do to a patient is to burden them with something of mine. That's not why they're there. And so I have to be really cautious about that.
Similar in that, it becomes very important to check in with myself in that moment. But to answer that question directly, there has been experiences of mine in caring for patients where I would say collectively as a clinical team, we all experienced grief. Probably the one that stands out the most is at the bedside of a young 18-month-old burn victim at Harborview, and I baptized this child with the entire team, and so and unfortunately the child did not survive. So there was a lot of collective grief from the physicians down the line. So I've experienced moments like that where we all feel that experience. I've also recognized times in relationship with people that it triggers my own experience of grief. And that is when I have to check in with myself, because it isn't about me in the moment. But that's why we work as a team together, so that we can hopefully trust that team to bring moments there to share. So yes, it's hard. That's probably why I'm not doing it anymore.
I just wanted to share something in relationship to this. I also worked as a chaplain, and one of my stints, I was a trauma chaplain, and you do sort of expect as a trauma chaplain to see a lot of grief, a lot of death. But it just seemed unusually conspicuous that when I was on call, it just seemed like a lot of people died, and a lot of young people. And I was chaplain at that time during summer in the trauma department, where there were a lot of boating accidents, and there were a lot of ATV accidents. And let me tell you something, I saw way too many teenagers with ATV accidents whose ATV, they just treat it like a toy, and it's so not, and it would roll over on them and injure them. At the end of that stint, I was making literally my last round on a specific floor, and one of the patients was 14 years old. He lost his leg from the knee down, and he lived. And for me, there was a great sense of joy of somebody who I had seen this accident over and over and over again, same kids his age who lost their lives. Here was one who survived. And I was filled with joy. But all he could experience was the grief of the loss of his limb, and how could he not? And part of what grief is, and what we are called to do, and how I identified my pastoral ministry in that moment, was that I was called to meet him where he was, not where I was. So checking in with myself and being like, I'm really happy today, but I don't need to make him see the silver lining in all of this, and we, in our own ways, we grieved, me and his parents grieved with him, and also celebrated that he was going home from the hospital together. So it was a different kind of place to be, and I think that in that, as we experience grief, but all of the emotions that go along with this, to meet people where they are, and not to impose necessarily where we are coming from.
Well, I had a question that kind of was into what you were talking about the time before this last question. I think all of us look on TV and see different cultures handling grief so differently, and particularly, I think of the Mideast and people just just totally giving in to screaming and yelling and crying. Is there any research? I mean, I don't think as Lutherans we could do that anyway.
I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah,
but if it hits you, you cannot help it.
Yeah, exactly. But as a community, I don't know if we, and I wonder if there's research on that being a healthier release than us trying to keep a stiff upper lip.
Yeah, so again, the question is, grief is cultural, and we see different people grieve in different ways. And maybe that sort of very white, Protestant, stiff upper lip kind of perspective may or may not be super healthy, and so we're kind of just exploring that a little bit. Oh, he's just ready to go.
I think, I don't know the research, sorry.
No.
My experience with folks trying to hold grief in versus letting it out, I can speak to that. I can also speak to experiencing different cultural moments of grief as powerful. I think the ability to let your experience be authentic is what's important. And whether that comes in the form of wailing, which, let me tell you, in sudden death, that's real. And those experiences, I've witnessed fainting, I've witnessed screaming, I've witnessed hitting. I mean, that doesn't feel like a stiff upper lip in the moment. I think my experience working as a bereavement coordinator, though, folks have set expectations on themselves of how grief should be. And it should follow A, B, C, D, and when it doesn't, it feels really hard. And so I think that's the voice that I would like to see from a culture, is letting people grieve and mourn as they need to, not in a ABC pattern, if you're out of it or not. Yeah.
So I heard a speaker a few years ago that said that stages of grief is a misnomer, in that it's not linear and sequential. It's more like a game of Pong. You go all over the map in those emotions. Do you agree with that? Have you seen that?
Yeah, yes, I do agree with that. I do think, though, that when you're in the throes of something that upends your whole being so much, you want someone to give you that answer. How am I gonna touch ground again? So I understand that desire to know that on January 12th of 2024, this is gonna be done, because I'll finish my steps. I think I learned early on that that's just not real, for me at least. And that would be my answer.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I used to, when it seemed appropriate, I used to tell people my opinion about how we all grieve, or how we all think we should grieve, or what our expectations are of grieving folks. And my observation is that particularly after a death, after a loss, the person left behind, if that's a spouse or whomever, there's this flurry of crazy activity that happens. There's an obituary, there's a funeral to plan, there's dealing with Social Security and the financial stuff. So there's all that business, but then there's also all this social contact. When if the funeral winds up being relatively close in time to the time of death, then when do we get together with family members that are not living close together? Funerals and weddings, right? So, you get folks that come to a wedding, they express their mourning, their sorrow for them, and then there's sort of a positive almost socially about what happens at funerals, because you're getting that contact with people that maybe you haven't always had contact with. But then that'll taper off, and so my observation for a lot of folks is that about 2 or 3 months after the death of someone who's not the spouse or the directly connected folks, life is back to normal for other people. They may still think of Joe who died, or Mary, and say, gee, I miss him, that's tough. But generally, day-to-day life, for most other folks, is back to normal in 2 or 3 months, and it is not for the survivors, for the direct survivors. So my comment to them is, don't focus on all the business and all the initial contact. As supportive as it is and as necessary as it is, make sure you're taking care of yourself and thinking about that when you're 2 and 3 months later, because that's sometime the point at which everything else seems to drop away, and the people that are surviving are kind of thinking, oh, wow, this certainly doesn't feel normal to me.
To which I find that initially at the death of someone, that the denial or the shock, you can really sort of sustain yourself, but not forever in that. And again, there's a busyness. Oftentimes grief can be so awful because there's nothing really to do with it, so you've got to kind of find something to do, and busying yourself with the practical stuff can feel like an escape. But this is where my ministry, and I'm sure Pastor Lori can testify to this too, that first moment in the funeral seems to connect to a person where they are truly in the midst of that mourning. Because I have seen people who were just, not really able to grieve, just kind of in that denial almost in a sense, until that first moment of the funeral. And because it's designated space, like this is space to grieve, this is time, that's what ritual does, is it creates a mark in time of intentionality. That suddenly there's the weeping, there's the mourning after I've walked this journey with them where they, like, oh yeah, I'm sad, but like there's not an expression. And to which I would say, whatever you feel in the midst of your grief and your pain, there is nothing wrong with that. We can express our grief and pain in unhealthy ways, but I think in general it's more important to open up those emotional pathways than to close them down. But in particular, I almost always in a funeral sermon, I say some version of, hey, whatever you're feeling today, know that that's okay. You might be grieving today. Maybe after a long illness and slow decline, maybe there's relief that you're feeling today. That's okay too. Maybe you didn't have the best relationship with this person and for some reason all you can feel is anger, or you're angry at God today for taking this person's life from you, right? Whatever you're feeling today, know that that's okay, it's healthy, and just sort of acknowledging that can be helpful. Rick, I saw your hand in the past.
I was just gonna, to me it seems like grieving is something that's personal. And that's why each person has to experience that in their own way. Mourning is more of seems to me to be more of the cultural aspect. There's periods of mourning, and it's called like that, and everybody observes that and respects that. But however you experience that death, that loss, the grieving is, and that's why it never goes away.
That's right.
The mourning has a period, but the grieving, it just comes back and back and back.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we see a new distinction between grief and mourning. Mourning potentially being cultural or almost formulaic in a sense.
We're black,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And the
But
shawl.
grief is something that we continue to carry with us forever. Absolutely.
So I like the image of an onion when I think of grief, or even a spiral, because I think we peel back layers. If you look at the onion, you move down a spiral, so you're still in there, but it's a different experience in processing those emotions. But it holds tight to us.
And sometimes it brings joy. That
Yeah.
same thing to you, that spits your hip.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just a thought and then an anecdote. One of the things that I've become very aware of is how people will cluster their concern around the funeral time, especially within the church, and how it's a month out when there is an echo chamber for the person who is grieving. So a card or something like that, just saying, I know that this continues to be a time where you are thinking about your loved one and no doubt missing them, or whatever the circumstances may be. But just to acknowledge, I know that this is still part of the reality for you. Because I think a person can feel like that, as you were saying, Bob, you do all this preparation, all this activity, and then it comes to a screeching halt, and there you are without the community that gathered at the funeral. So I think that that's something I would commend to the church community especially. I was sitting here thinking, maybe we need to have sponsors like we do for baptism, where we actually think about that, I've connected people who have experienced common griefs and said, you might want to talk to this person. But the other thing that comes to mind though is, since my grandma lived 105 years and we were talking about the longer you live, the more griefs that you carry with you. When my grandpa was dying of cancer, so she was 74 at the time, she told me all the stories about her son that died when he was 5. And that was the first time that I heard exactly how my uncle had died, how old my dad was at the time, how she handled, it was my great grandma who had my uncle pull his hand away from her and run out into traffic. So all of these details came flooding back for her, and it became an opportunity then to share those, you know, Anna, you were talking about layers of grief. In some ways, it's like you can cut the onion open, but the layers don't go away, right? You just get to see more of the rings. So I think being alert to the possibility that because one grief can cause another one to erupt from our memories and heart, to just be open to having a different conversation than you anticipated he would have.
Yeah, and I guess I just want to go back to when I originally mentioned that grief doesn't just come with the death of a human, or grief comes from all kinds of losses, the experience of a spouse who's less mobile, the inability to drive, and often that is countercultural, right? We just want to say, you're okay, great, let's go on. So taking the moment and actually listening makes a big difference in people's lives. Yeah.
I would add to Lori's list, I think we need to be educated as a congregation regarding what's helpful and what isn't. My college roommate and closest friend lost her son as a student studying in Japan. And it was an awful thing because they didn't know, they couldn't find him, and you know, that sort of thing. So a year after, and her grief was still very real, and she'd want to talk about that with people. And she had 4 or 5 people in her church saying, you know, you got to get it together, it's been a year. And I just couldn't believe when she told me they were in her church. I thought, you're kidding me. We need to have people know that, of course she was still grieving it. Good. She's still grieving now 20 years later, and of course she is. You know, I mean, good grief.
Yeah, good grief, yeah.
Yeah, excuse me.
But that phrase means something, to grieve and to grieve well. I feel like it's kind of a form of emotional congestion. If you don't grieve, it clogs up this thing within us. Grief is also cyclical. Every time we peel back another layer of loss, there is more, we re-experience all the losses that have come before. One of the things I think about, some of you know we've been praying for my mom recently. She had surgery and she's doing well. But when she initially had that injury, it's kind of like this great fear. Will she get better? Will she ever be better, you know, in a sense? And one Sunday, I was distributing communion, and I broke down weeping while I did that. There are a few different reasons for that. One, the sacrament is a really special part of my spiritual life. But I was communing a little kid with his mom, and immediately I had this flash of my mom. Before I had done First Communion class, she would slip me a little bit of bread. Not dissimilar from what Harmony did with Howie before he was baptized. And I had this moment, I broke down crying, and I was so afraid for the poor mother. I was like, why is he crying all of a sudden? So I pulled her aside and explained things, and she was so sweet. She was comforting me in my anticipatory grief. I can't get into all the different ways of healthy and less, healthy ways of grieving. But one thing that I will say, culturally, men, we are often taught not to express any emotion. But oftentimes, the one emotion that is acceptable to express is anger. And one of my CPE supervisors, he said, anger is always a secondary emotion. It is always in reaction to something else. And I have seen men react angry in the midst of grief. And I also have seen men react angry in a way that makes them think that I'm angry, so I'm going to punch a hole in a wall. Or I'm going to yell. And wailing is fine. Yelling at someone isn't fine. But what kind of happens in this sort of, you hear people like use the term toxic masculinity. This is the kind of stuff that we're talking about. It's not that men are bad. I think some people have interpreted it that way. It's just we have been socially taught in a way that says, you know what? It's not okay for you to express grief. It's not okay to express, it's not okay to cry. As a chaplain, I once saw a man openly weeping over his grievously ill brother. But he was in denial about his tears as they were falling from his face. And I literally said to him, it's okay to cry. And he said, I'm not crying. And it was just like, okay, dude, you know. But the thing is, I shared my tears with him. And sometimes being present with somebody's grief is just sharing with them and acknowledging that. So, yeah.
Did you have a question?
Well, I was just gonna piggyback on something that Jen said. I grieved with hospice, online Zoom,
Yeah.
for a year. I will have to say that that was a year that I joined a small group with church, which was tremendous. So I grieved that way. Then, a year later, well, a little longer than that, we got to have a service. And everything was fresh again.
Yeah.
And that was really difficult because it was like starting over.
Yeah.
And so time and people would come up to you a year later and they'd say, how are you doing? And but you know, I'd give some answer that I don't know what I said. And even my own family couldn't understand why I started over again. So it's just different. As you say, and people are so awkward, they just don't know what to say to you. I will say though, that my husband cried openly from diagnosis to the end, and it was wonderful.
Fred?
I'd like to get to some of the things that we shouldn't say. I had a very unfortunate experience going into church, seeing a woman I hadn't seen for a long time, and saying, so how you doing now? Oh, it's very difficult with our son's suicide last week. That was unbelievable for me.
Yeah.
And I still don't know what to do with that. I didn't know, and she said the truth. So the things when we do know that we're not supposed to say, you said you might get to that.
Yeah. You want to share a few
My
things?
favorite one is when God closes a door, He opens a window. And I often say, BS.
So I've heard from, some of this is from grieving parents of kids who've died. And so you've got it, there's one of them. I know how, or there's ways, two different ways of saying this. One is, oh, I know how you feel. It doesn't matter what your losses have been. You shouldn't ever tell someone else you know how they feel.
Even if you've had a similar experience.
Exactly. Now, the other thing though is to say the opposite and to say, I can't imagine how you feel. So you just told them that obviously what you're feeling is the worst thing ever for anybody in this world. They know that. It is for them, and they don't need a reminder. So some of those kind of things that sound, the intention is to be warm, but what's heard is oftentimes hurtful in that regard. So I think those are two of the ones that are most forward on my mind.
Yeah, just, so the other thing that we were always told is to never offer anyone a Kleenex because it stops the emotion.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's interesting.
Now, she doesn't hold it behind her like this.
Here you go. Because if they trust you enough to share emotion, that's important to let it
Oh,
go.
that's so interesting.
Yeah.
We had a grief support group here, and we have a woman in the congregation in her mid to late 80s who grieves the loss of her 2-year-old child many years ago. And she said, people say, aren't you over that yet? She says, it was my baby, and he died, and we did not expect it. No, I'm not over it.
You know, I often think of as grief as something that you never get over, but you learn to live with.
And Rick?
Yeah, I mean, I just retouching on the serial grief. And my mom had Alzheimer's. Excuse me. And every time I visited her, it's like I felt grief. And I couldn't express it because she was alive. But that would really, and that went on for years. And so it's like, that was one of the cases where I grieved before she died.
Yeah.
And by the time she died, it was celebration. Because,
That's right.
you know, same thing with when my brother died. He had diabetes and he died, and we knew it was coming, and we didn't know when. But it was sudden when it happened. And so it's like, that was a combination of sort of grief, obviously grief, but also the release was joyous.
Yeah, it's interesting how you can live into both.
That's right.
So it's just like, you know, sometimes there's just no words. You can't say the right thing.
Yeah.
So it's just, you
Yeah.
don't have to say anything, you just have to be there.
100%.
I'll do a little self-disclosure here because I learned a lot from this experience, this personal experience when my mom died. My dad was a survivor at that point, and he was not an asocial person, but he wasn't anyone who ever reached out to anybody. The direct quote from him is his ideal place to live is to go to the end of the road and 10 miles further. So you kind of get the vibe from him. No way did I ever think that he would accept a bereavement program from hospice to help him in his grief with my mom. So had I just gone with my assumption, I would have just said, well, you just gotta, go see your doctor and blah, blah, blah. And he was contacted by the hospice program. He accepted it, he went, and he got a lot out of it. And I was floored. And so what I learned is that you can't ever assume that you know how someone is going to accept or not accept or participate with their grief. So don't ever write them off. That was what I learned from that.
Anna, you brought a book with you, and it makes me think you might have a quote you want to share with
Oh, I
us.
have one of my favorite poems, I guess
Oh,
you'd say.
wonderful.
This is John O'Donohue. I don't know if any of you know him. Yes, I'm seeing some yeses. He died at 52 or 53. But I love this poem, and it's called For Grief. When you lose someone you love, your life becomes strange. The ground beneath you gets fragile. Your thoughts make your eyes unsure, and some dead echo drags your voice down, where words have no confidence. Your heart has grown heavy with loss, and though this loss has wounded others too, no one knows what has been taken from you when the silence of absence deepens. Flickers of guilt kindle regret for all that was left unsaid or undone. There are days when you wake up happy, again inside the fullness of life, until the moment breaks and you are thrown back onto the black tide of loss. Days when you have your heart back, you are able to function well, until in the middle of work or encounter, suddenly with no warning, you are ambushed by grief. It becomes hard to trust yourself All you can depend on now is that, sorrow will remain faithful to itself, more than you. It knows its way and will find the right time to pull and pull the rope of grief, until that coiled hill of tears has reduced to its last drop. Gradually you will learn acquaintance with the invisible form of your departed. And when the work of grief is done, the wound of loss will heal, and you will have learned to wean your eyes from the gap in the air and be able to enter the hearth in your soul where your loved one has awaited your return all the time.
I think we need to end it there, but I kind of want to end a little bit differently today because I think this has touched so closely to so many of us. So, the peace of Christ be with you always. And I invite you to share a sign of Christ's peace with one another and to comfort one another in our grief today. Thanks for joining me. Thank you.